what I'd like to do is to introduce Adam Cross, who's going to be presenting to us on holistic health. And he's with the Global Ecohealth Network and Curtin University. He's the Science Director for Ecohealth Network, and until recently was the Restoration Manager for Indigenous Trust, Gelganium Limited. He's the recipient of multiple awards for research excellence, and I have participated in an online forum with him, and it's really exciting to see how the connection, which Mika was talking about right from the outset today, between human health, community health, and ecosystem health are just so interwoven. Now, this doesn't sound like brain surgery, does it, really? However, it hasn't necessarily been what's been in our common land care story as prime understandings in the early days, but that understanding has really grown. So I'm really pleased to welcome Adam Cross.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to people who are actually doing a great deal of ecological restoration and other activities, as opposed to my usual audience, which is people who think about it and tend to not do a great deal of actual hands in the dirt sort of stuff. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Noongar peoples who have been and always will be the custodians of this land and the land that I spend most of my time working on. So as has been intimated, nothing in this presentation is going to be fundamentally groundbreaking, right? That nature is good for people. We are a part of nature. Everyone loves to think of humans as very highly evolved and not necessarily animals, which actually is not really untrue. But in many respects, we tend to forget the fact that we've evolved over extraordinarily long periods within and a part of the environment that's around us. That has led to absolutely fundamental linkages between the way that our biology works and the way that the environment around us works. For example, even the gut flora inside our stomachs rely upon exposure to certain environmental microbes at the early stages of our development, and not having those microbes in some of our urban areas is causing illness and causing a lot of the public health concerns that we now see spreading wide and fast. And unfortunately, there is an inequity in access to nature and things like that that are really causing this to become a broader social and public health issue. There's a lot of different pathways that have been proposed for why nature is good. This is in the Western literature, where we're trying to look at mechanisms and processes and boil down to specific parts of ecosystems. But it is really a holistic concept. And if you look into some of the lore, some of the stories, particularly in Noongar culture, as one of the oldest cultures, if not the oldest culture on the earth, there are stories and ways of knowing that are intrinsically eco-health and this holistic concept of an ecosystem approach to nature, that have just been passed down for thousands and thousands of generations. We're not doing anything other than reinventing the wheel here, or trying to understand some of the pathways by which these stories have long told us things that are correct. When I say that there's a lack of evidence, we live in a world where decision makers, particularly policy decision makers, require rock hard numbers to be able to give people money. I'm sure that pretty much everyone in this room has had exactly that issue with pretty much everything that you do day to day. The problem is that law and culture and anecdotal evidence and things like that don't win grants, don't get funding from governments, don't allow us to go to groups like the Australian Research Council and go as academics on our hands and knees begging for cash. We need some form of a traditional sort of Western evidence base to be able to get that funding and unlock the opportunities that we require to really integrate this into things like restoration. And that's where we have, as a global community, but particularly as a scientific community, said, well, we're in a really bad place, and it's getting worse really quickly. And we've got a lot of kids. Everyone who has kids, people like myself who's thinking about having kids, that's a terrifying concept, that they're going to grow up in a world that is genuinely knackered. But we're at a point where we still have a little bit of time where we can avert that course, and as the purpose of today is about, reimagine how we're going to move towards that future. Crucially, and really importantly, it's beginning to impact economies. And people in power don't like things impacting economies because it means they have less money, less power, and therefore, why do they need to exist? In particularly more developed countries like Australia, where theoretically we've got the expertise and the money to be able to undertake remediatory, restorative, rehabilitation, etc. activities at the scale that we actually need to avert these issues, the growing economic imperative to make change is driven by, particularly increasingly, the public health imperative. And that is because we are currently being hit with a burden of about $517 million a day in mental ill health. That is a cost that the Australian government, and more significantly the global series of governments around the world, cannot continue just absorbing. We need to do something about it. Obviously, there's a great many of you here from areas like the Wheat Belt, but just very briefly, WA and the Wheat Belt offers one of the best case studies anywhere in the world of this problem, where we go, oh, brilliant, open landscape that, let's just say, doesn't belong to anyone. Let's clear as much of that as we possibly can in the shortest time possible, grow stuff on it, because growing stuff is good and we can sell it, and then oops, actually that's gone bad really quickly and now huge areas are unproductive, and we're starting to see trends where people in those areas are really not very healthy. Maybe there's a link between the two. And in the mid sort of 2010s, Peter Spelderwindy and others at UWA and now increasingly elsewhere have found some really, really tangible evidence for direct linkages between depression and the degradation of landscapes, particularly increasing salinisation, but that's just one example. And crucially, there's a whole raft of comorbidities with depression. So degradation of landscapes could be interpreted as causing a greater increase of heart disease, but it's actually the fact that increased depression then coincidentally causes an increased incidence of heart disease. So this kind of story, where we're getting regional scale, continental scale changes to how people's well-being is being affected by the ecosystems around them, is finally starting to drive a little bit of change in the political willpower around maybe we should consider people and people's well-being in decision-making around how we approach environmental matters. So the field of ecohealth in which I'm increasingly working is around this idea that the degradation of landscapes can be considered an illness, not only because it is damaging to the ecosystems themselves, but also because it's damaging to us, to our societies, to our livelihoods, to our health. But restoration, whether that is anywhere along the spectrum of activities that are sort of currently considered restoration, from weeding activities or feral animal control, right the way through to completely repairing and rebuilding ecosystems through ecological restoration, is kind of a, maybe not a cure, but an intervention, and increasingly being seen as a very powerful public health intervention as well as an environmental intervention. There's a whole raft of pathways by which that action can be realized. I think that it's essentially summarized by saying that it brings us back to nature. That might be in the sense of highly complex pathways like exposure to microbes or to the kind of volatile compounds that plants release, which are, they have anti-inflammatory effects in our airways, they have antioxidant properties. There's all sorts of things that ecosystems breathe out that as we breathe in is very good for our health and our mental well-being. The gut's connected to the brain with a single pathway, and as our gut health changes, our mental well-being also changes. But crucially, it's not just about what the restoration of ecosystems can do for communities and livelihoods and regions. The very act of participating in restoration is also in and of itself restorative. Things like hope and seeing life and seeing regeneration actually have intrinsic, innate biological improvements to our health and well-being. So there is now a really strong and growing international imperative to get people involved in doing stuff in nature, and also get people involved in repairing nature, because that also then repairs us. And there's a wonderful statement which was used as the headline for a recent grant that we were successful in securing from the Australian Research Council, which is that we, as a society, are utterly reliant upon the ecosystems in which we live, whether that is for our livelihoods and well-being, or whether it is just a very sort of biological purpose for existing on the earth. As I mentioned, it's absolutely most crucial in areas where people are already most disadvantaged. And in Western Australia, as much as, again, we often like to overlook these sorts of things, those communities are all too often Indigenous communities and remote farming communities that are distant from urban centres and therefore not in the public eye. We get a lot of comments in Perth, particularly from politicians, saying things like, why would we care about that mine or that area of disturbance? It's not in our backyard. It's always in someone's backyard. It's just not always convenient to consider their well-being and their interests in the balance between economic development and their well-being. So the group that I represent as science director and work with is a Boston-based group, but it's an international network called the Ecohealth Network, and it's essentially an action-oriented organisation that aims to see some developmental improvement and some capacity building in the empirical links between undertaking restoration and human health and well-being. There's loads and loads of research that's being done all around the world in this space, but it's often being done heavily siloed. So you'll have public health scientists and epidemiologists who'll examine cohort studies of people and their health and well-being, but they'll just talk about green space. And there's no attempt made to determine whether that green space might be a lawn or biodiverse natural remnant vegetation. There is a huge quality difference in the exposure metrics between those two ecosystems, but it's been kind of completely disregarded in that epidemiological literature. And similarly, as ecologists, we have a tendency to look at ecosystems and consider how we can repair ecosystems and give virtually no thought whatsoever to the potential for those ecosystems to deliver human outcomes. Sociologists, etc., are kind of bridging between the two, but we really need those three groups, plus economists, to be speaking all together. So it's this kind of naturally multidisciplinary field where necessarily we need to break down the current barriers that exist, particularly in science, and get people talking about the whole raft of sciences, social sciences and cultural sciences, so that we can actually start learning from each other. And I think land care is one of those excellent examples where people have been doing this stuff for like 50, 60, 100, 150 years, but it's not trickling upwards in the system to the people that then influence policy development and can undertake, the research programs that can develop the information to then guide policy and funding development. And as I was talking to someone at the lunch break, I think what's really important is that you see small projects undertaken by land care groups and other activities that achieve great success, large-scale projects that are well known in the public sphere that are kind of just trash but are put out there as great success. And there's a much less attention paid to the successes of smaller groups. I won't dwell too long on the aims of EHN, but I think it's important that EHN and the Four Islands Ecohealth Network group, which is a network that we've established throughout Australia and New Zealand, the entire purpose of this group as an action network is to start telling those stories of the smaller groups, telling the stories of success, looking towards how these things can actually be achieved, even if it's just at small scales initially and then worked up to larger scales. Because what's really missing at this moment from the narrative around restoration and landscape scale change is hope. There is not a lot of people out there that genuinely can go through the wheat belt and see the potential for that to be changed for the benefit. They just see acres and acres and acres of degraded barren landscape. The concepts behind eco-health and the need to incorporate environmental approaches into human health have actually been picked up now by the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. They've been incorporated into the strategy document of the UN Decade, and we should now, hopefully, if that actually achieves anything, start seeing some of these actions and initiatives rolled out around the world, not just in Western Australia. But one crucial thing which I think is very topical when you consider that a lot of projects at the moment are looking at things like soil carbon, for example, is that restoration traditionally has focused on putting back vegetation and has not considered anything else in ecosystems, fauna, microbiota, etc. And yet, overwhelmingly, the evidence from a human health perspective suggests that soil health, soil microbiome particularly, is one of the most crucial pathways by which human health benefits are delivered. And coincidentally, it's also the foundational building blocks upon which ecosystems develop. If we don't get soil right, we don't get anything else right. And there needs to be a much greater focus in policy development, but also throughout even small-scale projects, post-fire recovery, some of the projects that we heard from today in small-scale catchments and things like that, even down to weed control, where we consider the impacts of our actions on soils and see how our actions can improve the health and functioning of soils as well. A message that probably won't be lost on the group today is that undertaking restoration for the sake of it is kind of a little meaningless unless it's part of something bigger, and that's why I think it's incredibly important that we see landscape scale connectivity based projects. There's a lot of high profile ones in Australia, more so I think than almost any other region of the world where such large scale restoration is necessary, like the US, because we've got a much better system of land management potential and groups like rangers and NRMs, etc., that can actually get out on ground and undertake the work, whereas in other jurisdictions, land access rights and legislation just simply don't allow for that sort of engagement. One of the very strong themes that is coming through increasingly out of the research in Australia is that we should finally be actually starting to listen to the people that have lived here for much longer than anyone else and know a hell of a lot more about the landscape than anyone else. And this is one of the key underpinnings of the centre that I mentioned earlier on that's been recently funded, the ARC Training Centre for Healing Country. It's an Australian Research Council funded initiative, and one of the key perspectives in that grant is to try and incorporate this idea of eco-health and the principles of how humans and ecosystems are intrinsically interlinked into everyday restorative activities and training pathways too, so that kids, Indigenous rangers, people working at local governments, maybe someday even politicians, can begin understanding the importance of going out and having meetings outside in the bush, or getting kids out into green spaces where they play with dirt and eat bugs and get their faces smushed into leaves and things like that. Because if they don't, they're going to have legacies of ill health and depression and all sorts of things, whether that's down to your understanding of things like the biophilia hypothesis, or whether it's just the pure empiricism of if you're exposed to things when you're a kid, you're less likely to get allergies when you're older. There's huge numbers of pathways, and if people don't actually understand the importance of these pathways, then we don't really have a lot of hope. You know, one of my good colleagues takes his newborn infant daily on smelling expeditions in their backyard, where they just go and smell whatever they can find. And the benefit to that kid of those experiences is something that you will never be able to quantify, but we're hoping that with a couple of new approaches, we might at least be able to begin quantifying that so that maybe a few other kids can go out on their daily smelling adventures. But the important thing with Healing Country and the concepts and principles that it articulates is that a lot of these things are really well known by Noongar culture. You know, the use of particular plants and crushing and smelling them, or smoking them, using them as a smoking ceremony, or particular resins or oils, etc., rubbed on infants or pregnant ladies. All of these things have a known anecdotal or Indigenous scientific proof of action, but the Western scientific community is kind of really slowly taking their time to catch up as to what those mechanisms actually are and the pathways by which they operate. This really aims to try and elucidate those mechanisms in a way that we can communicate them to non-Indigenous people as well, utilising and honouring that knowledge, bringing it to as many different groups as possible so that all of Australian society has the opportunity to learn from and benefit from those experiences. I've gone all the way through. Sorry, thank you.